The night was thick with silence. The kind that wrapped around the trees and swallowed every sound before it could escape. The stars hung like scattered diamonds against the velvet sky, and the cold air carried the faintest scent of rain, teasing the edges of an oncoming storm. Elliot Grayson pulled his coat tighter around his frame as he walked along the narrow dirt path behind his estate. He had walked these woods many times before, seeking solitude, escaping the constant demands of his wealth and power, and losing himself in the quiet that only nature could provide. But tonight, something felt different. There was a strange tension in the air, an unease that settled in his bones, though he couldn't quite place why. Then he heard it, a sound so faint, so fragile, that at first, he thought he had imagined it. A cry, thin and weak, barely louder than the rustling of the leaves. He stopped mid-step, his breath catching in his throat as he turned his head. Listening. Nothing. Just the trees swaying in the breeze. The distant hoot of an owl. The steady rhythm of his own heartbeat drumming in his ears. But then it came again. A desperate, muffled whimper. Elliot's entire body tensed. It wasn't an animal, it was human. His heart pounded as he stepped off the path, pushing aside branches and crunching over damp leaves. His expensive leather shoes sank slightly into the soft earth. But he didn't care. The cry was growing weaker, fading into the night, and a sense of urgency gripped him, forcing him to move faster. As he pushed further into the underbrush, the moonlight barely reached him, swallowed by the towering trees. He scanned the darkness ahead, his sharp eyes searching for the source of the sound. Then he saw it, nestled between the thick roots of an old oak tree, hidden beneath a crude layer of leaves and branches, was a small basket. Elliot's breath caught, his pulse thundered in his ears as he crouched down, his hands shaking slightly as he peeled back the damp foliage. Inside the basket, swaddled in thin, threadbare blankets, were 3 infants. He exhaled sharply, the air stalling in his throat. They were so small, too small, their fragile bodies barely visible beneath the tattered fabric that did nothing to protect them from the creeping cold. One of them, a boy with the faintest tuft of dark hair, let out another soft, pitiful whimper, his tiny fists trembling against the night air. Elliot stared, his mind struggling to process what he was seeing. Who would do this? His stomach twisted. He had seen many things in his life, cutthroat business deals, betrayals, corruption, but this was something else entirely. Carefully, he reached out, his fingers brushing against one of the baby's tiny palms. Instinctively, the child latched onto him, gripping his finger with all the desperate strength of something that refused to let go. A strange tightness coiled in Elliot's chest. Something unfamiliar, something that made his breath come unevenly. The wind whispered through the trees, carrying with it the scent of earth and rain. A storm was coming. There was no time to waste. Gritting his teeth, Elliot lifted the basket, careful, so careful, not to jostle the babies too much. They were light, painfully light, their bodies stiff with the effort of clinging to warmth that barely existed. His mind raced ahead, calculating his next move, who to call, what needed to be done, what this meant, because there was no walking away from this, no pretending he hadn't seen. His life, his carefully controlled, meticulously structured life, had just changed forever. And there was no going back. As he turned toward the path leading home, the old trees creaked against the wind, their shadows stretching long and dark under the silver glow of the moon. The night pressed in around him, silent but watchful. Somewhere out there, someone knew what they had done. And one day, they might come looking for what they left behind. Elliot Grayson stood at the threshold of his grand estate, his expensive coat dripping with mist and mud, his breath visible in the cold night air, the basket in his arms, no heavier than a sack of flour. Yet carrying the weight of 3 tiny lives, felt as though it was anchoring him to something greater than himself. Something irreversible. He had stepped into the woods a man alone, untethered by obligation, living life with the cold precision of a businessman. But now, as he crossed the threshold into his house, he knew he was no longer alone. His housekeeper, Margaret, had spent the last 20 years managing the estate with military efficiency. The moment he stepped into the marble foyer, she turned from where she had been tidying the table near the fireplace, her eyes widening at the sight of her employer, disheveled, breathless, and carrying a basket full of infants. "My God," she whispered, her hands flying to her mouth. "Elliot, What? What is this? The warmth of the house was a stark contrast to the cold outside. But the children's fragile bodies shivered despite it. They were freezing. Get the fire going, Elliot ordered, his voice steadier than he felt. Now, Margaret didn't ask any more questions. She had worked for the Grayson family since Elliot was a child. And if there was one thing she had learned about him, it was that when he spoke like this, there was no arguing. She rushed toward the hearth, stacking logs and stoking the embers back to life. Elliot carried the basket to the plush couch, gently lowering it onto the soft surface before kneeling beside it. The smallest baby let out a weak, pitiful cry, his little fists barely strong enough to move against the worn blanket wrapped around him. Margaret hurried back, a thick towel in one hand, a bottle of warm milk in the other. You found them like this? She asked, her voice shaking as she began carefully unwrapping the damp fabric around the babies. Elliot nodded, his jaw tight. Someone left them out there, alone, in the woods. If I hadn't been walking, he exhaled sharply, unable to finish the thought. Margaret sucked in a breath, her hands pausing for a moment. Abandoned. The word neither of them said hung heavy in the room. The fire cast a golden glow over the living room, bathing everything in a flickering warmth. Elliot reached for the smallest baby, a boy with dark tufts of hair, and held him against his chest. The child's body was frighteningly still at first, but as Elliot gently rubbed his tiny back, the warmth started to seep in. Slowly, the baby relaxed against him. Margaret handed him the bottle. Here, hold him like this, support the head. Just like that. Now, tip the bottle slightly. Good. Elliot had signed billion-dollar contracts, negotiated with some of the most cutthroat businessmen in the world, and never once felt as unsure as he did now. The baby latched onto the bottle, sucking weakly. Elliot exhaled in relief. Margaret worked with practiced hands, tending to the other two infants, feeding them, drying their tiny limbs, wrapping them in fresh, warm blankets. She moved efficiently, but Elliot noticed the way her fingers trembled slightly. They were both shaken. Do you think someone will come looking for them? Margaret finally asked, glancing up. Elliot's jaw tightened. He had searched. After finding them, he had scoured the surrounding woods, calling out into the night, looking for any sign of movement, any trace of the person who had left them behind. There had been nothing. They didn't want them found, he said quietly. His voice was cold, but inside, he was burning. Margaret swallowed hard, her lips pressing into a thin line. What do we do? Elliot looked down at the child in his arms. The little boy's fingers curled around his thumb, his grip surprisingly strong for something so small. Elliot had no siblings, no children, no attachments to anyone except the company he had spent the last decade building from the ground up. But sitting here, holding a life so fragile, so utterly dependent, something inside him shifted. We keep them safe, he said, the words surprising even himself. Until we find out where they came from. Until we know the truth. Margaret nodded, though there was worry in her eyes. And if no one comes? Elliot didn't answer. He just looked down at the baby in his arms. Because, deep down, he already knew. The hours passed in a blur. Doctors were called to check on the children, ensuring they weren't suffering from anything more serious than exposure. Calls were made. Authorities were contacted. But no missing children had been reported. No one was looking for them. At some point in the early hours of the morning, Elliot sat in his study, staring at the flickering fire, a single piece of paper in his hands. It had been tucked into the basket, barely visible beneath the damp fabric. A note, written in shaky, hurried script. Protect them. He can't know where they are. The words sent a chill through him, colder than the night air had been. Someone had left them on purpose. Not because they were unwanted, but because they were in danger. Margaret entered the study quietly. Elliot, you should rest. You haven't slept. He turned the paper over in his hands. Someone went through the trouble of leaving them near my house. Margaret, not in town, not by the hospital. Here. Margaret frowned. You think they knew you'd find them? He exhaled. I don't know. But the weight of it sat heavy on his chest. 3 perfectly healthy infants abandoned under circumstances that made no sense. A desperate note warning of an unknown, he. This wasn't just a tragedy. It was a mystery. And Elliot intended to solve it. Morning came too soon. Elliot had barely closed his eyes when the soft cries of the infants stirred through the house again. Margaret was already awake, rocking one of them in her arms. Shushing gently. "They're getting stronger," she murmured. "That's a good sign." Elliot stood in the doorway, watching. Something in his chest ached, though he didn't understand why. He had never planned for this. Never imagined his life entangled with 3 fragile lives. But fate had other plans. As he stepped forward, taking one of the babies into his arms again, he felt it settle inside him, a responsibility he never asked for, but couldn't walk away from. This wasn't just a mystery anymore. This was his life now. And he wouldn't let anyone take it from him. Who left the children? Who is the mysterious he in the note? What danger are these infants truly in? Stay tuned for the next part. And leave a comment below if you think Elliot is making the right choice. Should he keep searching for answers? Or just focus on protecting them? Let us know. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more gripping stories like this one. Elliot Grayson never considered himself a sentimental man. His world revolved around numbers, contracts, and calculated risks, not crying infants swaddled in threadbare blankets. Yet here he was, pacing the grand hall of his estate, a newborn pressed against his chest, its tiny fingers clinging to his shirt as though letting go was not an option. It had been 2 days since he found them in the woods. 2 days of restless nights, endless crying, and an unsettling realization. These children weren't just abandoned, they had been left with a purpose. But what kind of mother leaves 3 helpless infants in the cold night? With nothing but a scribbled note pleading for protection? The note still sat on his desk. Its faded ink burned into his mind. Protect them. He can't know where they are. Elliot hadn't stopped thinking about it. His housekeeper, Margaret, had been working tirelessly, fussing over the babies with a maternal devotion that contrasted Elliot's awkward handling. She knew what she was doing. Elliot, on the other hand, did not. He hadn't slept. He hadn't worked. He hadn't even left the house. And that terrified him the most. He was losing control. A wail tore through the grand estate, breaking his thoughts. Elliot sighed and looked down at the baby in his arms, Simon, the smallest of the 3. His face was red from crying, his tiny fists waving as though protesting something Elliot couldn't understand. "What do you want?" Elliot muttered, shifting the infant slightly. "I've already fed you, changed you, held you. What else is there?" Simon hiccuped and let out another whimper. Margaret peered in from the kitchen, wiping her hands on a dish towel. "Try rocking him." Elliot shot her an exhausted glare. "I am rocking him. Not like you're waiting for a business deal to close." She huffed, walking over. "Like this, gentle, soothing. Babies aren't stock investments, Mr. Grayson." Elliot opened his mouth to argue but stopped himself. He had no comeback because she was right. Margaret took Simon from him. And within seconds, the baby settled, his cries turning into soft hiccups against her shoulder. Elliot rubbed his temples. "How do you know how to do that?" Margaret hesitated before answering. "I've had practice." He glanced at her, catching something in her expression, something unspoken, something painful. "You never mention children, because it's not a story I like to tell." Elliot didn't push, but something about the way she held Simon, her fingers trembling just slightly, made him wonder how much of herself she saw in these children. Elliot barely had time to process any of it before the second baby started crying. Then the third. Peter and Sean were fussing in their cribs, their tiny limbs wriggling as their cries filled the estate. Elliot turned, exasperated. "Are they always like this?" Margaret gave a tired chuckle. "Babies don't exactly keep to your schedule, Mr. Grayson. They're relentless. They're alive," she corrected, shifting Simon against her hip. "And they need more than just shelter. They need love, patience, and stability, things you might not be used to giving." Elliot ran a frustrated hand through his hair. She was right. Again. It was after midnight when Elliot finally managed to get them all to sleep. He stood over the cribs, staring down at them with something he refused to name. What was he supposed to do with them? He turned toward his study, determined to clear his mind. But then, a noise. A sharp rustling outside the window. Elliot's instincts kicked in immediately. He strode toward the massive glass doors leading to the back patio. Peering into the darkness. Nothing. But something felt wrong. He grabbed his coat and stepped out. The cold air biting against his skin. The trees swayed gently, whispering secrets he couldn't understand. Then he saw it. Footprints in the damp soil. Someone had been here. His heart pounded. The note. Protect them. Whoever left the children had been nearby. Maybe even watching. Elliot clenched his fists, his protective instincts burning hotter than ever. Whoever he was. Whoever had threatened these children. They weren't going to get near them. Not as long as Elliot was here. By morning, something was wrong. Margaret was feeding Sean when she noticed it. His skin was too warm. His tiny body, once squirming and full of energy, felt limp. Elliot, Margaret called, her voice edged with worry. He's burning up. Elliot's heart dropped. Simon and Peter were fine, sleeping peacefully in their cribs. But Sean, his tiny chest rose and fell too quickly. His face flushed with an unnatural heat. Margaret grabbed a damp cloth, pressing it to his forehead. We need a doctor. Now. Elliot had never felt fear like this before. He called for his driver, demanding they get to the hospital immediately. He held Sean in his arms during the ride, his usually restless body completely still. Stay with me, little guy, Elliot muttered under his breath. You made it this far. You don't get to give up now. The drive was the longest 20 minutes of his life. The doctor's words blurred together as they rushed Sean inside, checking his vitals, examining him under bright white lights. Fever, infection, weak immune system. The words hit Elliot like a gut punch. He was left in the cold for too long. The doctor explained, he's strong, but his body is still recovering from exposure. Elliot barely registered the medical jargon. He just stared at the tiny baby on the hospital bed, an IV in his fragile arm. Can I hold him? Elliot asked. The nurse hesitated but finally nodded. It might help him feel safe. Elliot carefully lifted Sean against his chest, his heart pounding. I've got you, he whispered. You're not alone anymore. And for the first time, he realized that neither was he. Sean made it through the night. By morning, his fever broke, and the doctors assured them he would recover. Elliot barely left his side. Margaret arrived with Simon and Peter, her relief palpable. You really care about them, she murmured. Elliot didn't answer at first. He just looked down at Sean, his fingers brushing over his tiny hand. I don't know how to care for them, he admitted, his voice quieter than usual. But I want to learn. Margaret smiled, the first genuine smile he had seen from her in days. That's a good start. Elliot exhaled, exhaustion weighing on him. I don't think I can go back to my old life. Margaret. She nodded. Good, because I don't think they'd let you. She gestured toward Simon and Peter, now awake, their tiny hands reaching toward him, their eyes full of trust. Elliot felt something shift inside him again. Maybe this wasn't just an accident. Maybe this was exactly where he was meant to be. Elliot Grayson had always prided himself on control. His entire life had been built around precision, making the right moves, predicting risks, and never allowing his emotions to dictate his choices. He had climbed his way to the top of the business world, amassing wealth and power, all by staying one step ahead of everyone else. But nothing could have prepared him for this. The three infants he had taken in, Simon, Peter, and Sean, had become the very center of his world in just a matter of weeks. He no longer saw them as helpless burdens left behind by an unknown past. They were his now, and he would protect them with everything he had. It started like any other morning. Elliot had barely slept, not because of work, but because Sean was teething, which meant a night full of tiny whimpers and exhausted pacing. He had finally drifted off in the nursery's rocking chair, Sean curled against his chest. When the sound of the front gate's intercom jerked him awake, he frowned. No one ever showed up at his estate uninvited. He carefully laid Sean back in his crib before making his way to the security monitor in his study. A woman stood at the gate, thin, shivering in the cold, her coat pulled tight around her frame. Her eyes were hollow, sunken with exhaustion, her hair damp from the lingering morning mist. And then, Elliot's blood ran cold. Because in her arms, clutched tightly against her chest, was a baby. His hands curled into fists as he hit the intercom. Who are you? The woman's gaze snapped up, her lips trembling. She took a deep breath, as if bracing herself for something. My name is Nina Carter, she whispered, and I think you have my children. Elliot had never moved so fast. In an instant, he was at the front door, his heart hammering against his ribs. Margaret had joined him, her face pale as she watched through the peephole. Do you believe her? Elliot clenched his jaw. He didn't know, but he needed to find out. The moment he opened the door, Nina's legs buckled. He caught her just before she hit the ground, her body weak, trembling with fatigue. "Please," she rasped. "Please let me in. I need to see them." Elliot hesitated, every instinct in him screaming to be careful. But then he looked down, at the infant in her arms. Barely a few months old, its little face scrunched in discomfort. He had no choice. Margaret helped her inside, and Elliot locked the door behind them. The fire in the living room crackled softly, filling the silent space with a warmth that felt foreign. Nina sat curled in the armchair, the baby in her lap, her hands gripping a cup of tea that she hadn't touched. Her eyes, however, were fixed on the nursery door, as though she were holding herself back from rushing inside. Elliot stood across from her, arms crossed, his voice low, firm. "Start talking." Her throat bobbed. She looked broken, barely keeping herself together. "They're mine," she whispered. "Simon, Peter, Sean, they're my sons." A thick silence filled the room. Margaret stilled. Elliot's fingers tightened against his arms. Nina took a shaky breath. "I had no choice. I had to leave them." Elliot's chest tightened. No mother leaves her children in the woods. "Tell me the truth." Tears pooled in her eyes. "I had no choice," she insisted. "He was going to kill them." Elliot froze. Margaret let out a sharp breath, her expression darkening. "Who?" Nina's lips trembled. "Their father." Nina's hands shook as she set down the cup, her fingers curling into the fabric of her coat like she was trying to hold herself together. "I was with him for years. At first, he was kind, charming. He made me believe I was safe." Her voice cracked. "But then I got pregnant." Elliot remained silent, his gut twisting. "I thought he would be happy." Nina continued, "that having a family would change things. But I was wrong. He saw them as leverage. Bargaining tools. He said, if anyone found out about them, he'd kill them." Margaret gasped. Elliot's fists clenched. "He locked us away," Nina whispered. "For months. I wasn't allowed to leave. I wasn't allowed to talk to anyone. He had eyes everywhere. And when I found out I was having triplets, that's when I knew. If I stayed, they wouldn't survive." Her voice was barely a breath now. "I waited until he was away on business. Then I ran. I didn't have a plan. Just desperation. I made it through the woods. But I knew I couldn't keep them safe. So I left them where anyone, could find them." Her fingers dug into her arms. "I thought I'd never see them again." Elliot didn't speak for a long time. His mind raced, every instinct warring against itself. This woman, this exhausted, broken woman, was claiming to be their mother. Did he believe her? Did he want to? He exhaled, running a hand down his face. "If you're telling the truth, then you know what's at stake. If their father is looking for them, you just led him straight here." Nina's face drained of color. "No, I was careful." Elliot turned to Margaret. "We need security around the property. No one in or out unless I approve it." Margaret nodded immediately. Nina's gaze lifted, pleading, "Please, I just want to see them." Elliot hesitated. Then, finally, he stepped aside. The nursery door creaked open, the soft scent of baby powder and warm blankets filling the air. And when Nina saw them, her sons, safe, sleeping peacefully, a choked sob tore from her throat. Her knees hit the floor beside the crib, her hands hovering over their tiny bodies, as if she was too afraid to touch them. "I'm so sorry," she whispered. "I'm so sorry." Tears dripped onto the blankets, her shoulders shaking with silent grief. Elliot watched, his chest tight, his emotions warring with logic. Because in that moment, he knew, she wasn't lying. These were her children, and if what she said was true, then someone out there was willing to kill to get them back. Elliot stood by the door, his mind made up. Nina was broken, desperate, barely holding herself together, but she was their mother. And if she had risked everything to find them again, then he would risk everything to protect them. Because this wasn't just about the babies anymore. This was about family. And Elliot Grayson would fight until his last breath to keep them safe. What do you think? Should Elliot trust Nina? Should he let her stay? Comment below and let us know. If you believe Elliot is doing the right thing, show your support by liking and subscribing. Elliot Grayson had never lost a fight in his life. Not in business, not in negotiations, not in anything. But now, for the first time, he realized he was fighting a war he couldn't afford to lose. It had been 3 weeks since Nina Carter arrived at his doorstep. Shivering, exhausted, and desperate. 3 weeks since she had whispered the truth he never wanted to hear, that the 3 boys who had become his entire world weren't abandoned by accident. They were being hunted. And now, as Elliot stood in his study, listening to the faint sounds of their soft breathing over the baby monitor, he knew their time was running out. Because whoever Nina was running from, he had found them. It started with a phone call. A number Elliot didn't recognize. He answered, his voice cold, measured. "Who is this?" Silence. Then, a slow, deep chuckle. Elliot's grip tightened around the phone. "You think you can keep them from me?" The voice was smooth, dark, amused. Elliot's stomach dropped. His blood turned to ice. Because he knew who this was. Jason Carter, the man who had tried to kill his own sons. Elliot's free hand clenched into a fist, his jaw tensing as he fought to keep his voice even. "You're mistaken if you think you'll ever touch them again." Jason laughed, a lazy sound laced with arrogance. "Oh, come on, Grayson. You're a businessman. You understand how these things work. You've been playing house with something that isn't yours." "They're not a something," Elliot snarled. "They're children, and they sure as hell aren't yours anymore." Jason hummed, as if bored. "Do you know what the problem is with rich men like you?" he mused. "You think money can fix everything. That power makes you untouchable. But the thing is, I don't play by the same rules." Elliot's heart pounded. This wasn't just a threat. It was a promise. "Walk away, Grayson," Jason said, his voice a whisper now, laced with venom, "before you end up buried in the same dirt you pulled my kids from." Then, the line went dead. Elliot stood there, his pulse a violent drumbeat in his ears. Then, without a word, he picked up his office phone and dialed a single number. Margaret answered immediately. "Sir? Lock the estate down. No one comes in or out without my permission. And get my security team in here. Now." Margaret hesitated. "Sir, is everything. Do it, now." There was no room for questions. Because the war had started. And Elliot was going to win. By the time Elliot reached the nursery, Nina was already there. She sat on the rocking chair. Sean curled against her chest, his tiny fingers grasping at the fabric of her shirt. Her face was pale, her lips pressed into a thin line as she ran a gentle hand down his back. She had heard the call. She knew. "Elliot," she whispered, her voice tight. "He found us, didn't he?" Elliot inhaled slowly, his entire body tense with restrained fury. He wouldn't lie to her. "Yes." Nina's arms tightened around Sean, as if shielding him from something unseen. She squeezed her eyes shut, her breath shuddering. "It's my fault," she whispered. Elliot's stomach hardened. "No." She let out a small, humorless laugh. "Yes, I should have run further. Should've. You did everything you could." His voice was firm, unwavering. "The only one at fault here is him." She looked up at him then, eyes shimmering with unshed tears. "He won't stop." Elliot knelt beside her chair, his hands gentle on her arms. "Neither will I." Silence. Then, her face crumbled. She had been fighting so long, running so far, and for the first time, she wasn't alone. Elliot reached up and brushed a stray tear from her cheek. "He doesn't get to take anything else from you." She exhaled shakily, nodding, because for the first time, she believed him. Elliot wasn't stupid. He knew Jason wouldn't wait. He wouldn't send another warning. He would come. And when he did, Elliot would be ready. Security cameras were checked. Alarms were reinforced. The estate was turned into a fortress overnight. But Elliot knew, Jason didn't fight fair. And sure enough, he came when they least expected it. The power cut out first. The estate was plunged into darkness. Then, glass shattered downstairs. Elliot's body moved before his mind caught up. He sprinted to the nursery, heart hammering. Margaret had already grabbed Simon and Peter, her face pale but resolute. "They're safe," she whispered. "I'll take them." Elliot nodded once, then turned to Nina. Her face was ashen, frozen with terror. And in her arms? Sean was still asleep. Elliot's throat tightened. "Take him. Go with Margaret." She shook her head. "No, now." "Nina." The look in his eyes left no room for argument. She clutched Sean tightly and disappeared down the hall. And Elliot turned to face the threat head-on. Jason Carter stood in the middle of the living room, a smirk on his face. The storm outside cast shadows across his sharp features. his eyes glinting with amusement as if this were all a game. Behind him, 3 armed men stood like ghosts in the dim light. Elliot stepped forward. "This is a mistake." Jason chuckled. "No, Grayson. The mistake was thinking you could keep something that belongs to me." Elliot's jaw tightened. "They're not property." Jason's smile sharpened. "Oh, but they are." He tilted his head. "You really think you're the hero in this story? Rich man swoops in, saves the helpless children, and suddenly he's their father?" His eyes darkened. "That's not how the world works." Elliot exhaled slowly. Then, he smiled. Jason's brow furrowed. "Funny thing about the world," Elliot murmured, pulling a small remote from his pocket. "It only belongs to the men who are smart enough to plan ahead." He pressed a button, and suddenly, the room filled with the sound of sirens. Jason stiffened. "You called the police 10 minutes ago?" Elliot smirked. "Yeah." Jason lunged. But before he could take a step, security burst through the doors. Guns raised. Orders shouted. And just like that, it was over. Elliot stood on the front steps as they dragged Jason away. His face twisted in fury. "This isn't over," Jason snarled. Elliot's smile was cold. "Oh, yes it is." The moment Jason disappeared into the police car, Elliot finally exhaled. Then, a small voice behind him. "Elliot?" He turned. Nina stood there, Sean cradled in her arms, eyes filled with relief. And at that moment, Elliot knew. This was no longer just protection. This was family. And he wasn't going anywhere. Elliot Grayson had never truly understood what it meant to be a father until that night. For weeks, he had cared for Simon, Peter, and Sean as if they were his own, ensuring their safety, feeding them, and watching over them as they slept. But deep inside, a part of him still felt like an outsider. He had taken them in. He had vowed to protect them. But did they see him as more than just another presence in their lives? Would they ever see him as their father? That night, Elliot found his answer. It was well past midnight when Elliot woke to a faint, muffled cry. He blinked against the darkness, his heart thudding slightly as he sat up. At first, he thought he had imagined it. Maybe it was just the sound of the wind whispering through the trees outside, or the distant hum of the security team making their rounds. But then, there it was again. A soft, trembling whimper. It wasn't coming from the baby monitor. It was coming from down the hall. Elliot was on his feet in seconds. Barefoot, he padded down the dimly lit corridor, his pulse quickening as he neared the nursery. The warm glow of the nightlight spilled from beneath the door, casting a soft amber hue onto the polished floor. He carefully pushed it open, his sharp gaze scanning the room. Simon and Peter were fast asleep, curled beneath their soft blankets, their tiny chests rising and falling in peaceful rhythm. But Sean was sitting upright in his crib, his small body trembling, his tear-filled eyes wide with fear. Elliot's chest tightened. Without hesitation, he crossed the room and gently lifted the child into his arms. Sean clung to him immediately, his tiny fingers curling into Elliot's shirt, his warm body trembling against his chest. Elliot lowered himself into the rocking chair, cradling the small boy close. "Shush," he murmured, soft and soothing. "I've got you." Sean let out another small sob, his face burying itself into Elliot's shoulder, his little hands fisting the fabric of Elliot's shirt as if terrified to let go. Elliot's heart broke. He rocked gently, running his palm over Sean's small back in slow, comforting circles. "What happened, buddy?" he whispered. Sean sniffled, his voice barely above a breath. "Be bad man." Elliot's blood ran cold. He pulled back slightly, just enough to see the boy's face. Sean's wide brown eyes shimmered with unshed tears, his lower lip trembling. "What bad man?" Elliot asked, his voice gentle. Sean's tiny hands gripped him tighter. "The bad man, he's gonna take us." Elliot's jaw locked. Jason. Even in his dreams, his sons weren't safe from him. Elliot exhaled slowly, reining in the anger that threatened to rise. Sean didn't need fury. He needed comfort. He needed to know that he was safe. Elliot pulled him back against his chest, resting his chin lightly atop Sean's soft curls. "No one is going to take you," he murmured. Sean sniffled. "Promise?" Elliot closed his eyes. He wasn't a man of empty words. He never made a promise he couldn't keep. And this? This was a promise he would fight to keep until his last breath. "I promise." Sean let out a small sigh, his tiny fingers still clenching at Elliot's shirt. And then, slowly, he relaxed. Elliot sat there, rocking him gently, long after the boy's breathing evened out. Because something inside Elliot had changed. This wasn't just about protecting them anymore. They were his sons, and he was their father. Elliot didn't go back to bed that night. Instead, he held Sean close and watched over the other boys, his mind racing with thoughts he had never allowed himself to consider before. Could he really do this? Could he truly be the father they needed? He had spent years alone, building an empire from the ground up, mastering the art of control, of precision, of never letting anyone in. But these boys, they had cracked something inside him. For the first time in as long as he could remember, Elliot Grayson was afraid, not of losing money, not of losing power, but of failing them. Because what if he wasn't enough? What if one day, they woke up and realized he wasn't the father they deserved? What if? A small, warm hand curled around his thumb. Elliot looked down. Sean was still asleep, his tiny fingers gripping Elliot's hand in a way that felt so trusting. So certain, that for the first time since this nightmare began, Elliot let himself believe, maybe he wasn't perfect, maybe he didn't have all the answers. But he would fight for them. Every day. For the rest of his life. And that would have to be enough. When dawn broke, golden light filtering through the nursery windows. Elliot still hadn't moved. Sean had shifted at some point during the night, curling against Elliot's chest like a small, sleeping kitten. He was warm. He was safe. He was home. Elliot barely noticed the door creak open. Nina stood there, still wrapped in her robe, her expression soft, unreadable as she took in the scene before her. Her lips parted slightly. "You stayed up all night?" Elliot exhaled, running a gentle hand down Sean's back. He had a nightmare. Nina stepped forward, her eyes lingering on Sean's peaceful face. "You didn't have to stay with him." Elliot finally looked up. "Yes, I did." Something flickered in Nina's gaze. Something unspoken. She took a slow step forward, then reached down and, without hesitation, brushed her fingers through Sean's soft curls. Elliot watched as she swallowed hard, her throat working against a surge of emotion. "You're good with them," she whispered. Elliot held her gaze. "I love them." Nina's breath hitched. She hadn't expected him to say it. Maybe neither had he. But he meant it. Every word. Nina let out a small, shaky breath. Then, slowly, carefully, she reached out and rested her palm over Elliot's. Warm, steady, unbreakable. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. Because at that moment, she understood. He wasn't just here to protect them. He wasn't just here because he felt responsible. Elliot Grayson was their father. And he wasn't going anywhere. Elliot Grayson never imagined himself as a man who would yearn for something as simple as belonging. He had spent most of his life building walls, fortresses of power, wealth, and control that kept the world at a distance. He never needed warmth. He never needed comfort. He never needed anyone. Until now. Until her. Nina Calloway had stormed into his life like a whirlwind. Fierce and unrelenting. She had fought him at every turn. Challenging his decisions. Pushing his limits. Making him question things he never dared to question before. She had refused to let him hide behind his money, his status, his reputation. And somewhere along the way, without even realizing it, Elliot had fallen for her. Not in the way men like him usually fell for women, with fleeting attraction. With empty charm. With the knowledge that it would never last. No. This was different. This was real. This was the kind of love that settled deep in the bones. That refused to be ignored. That made him afraid. Because he had spent so long believing he was incapable of love. And now? Now he couldn't imagine a world without her. It started with something simple. An accident. A moment that shouldn't have meant anything, but meant everything. That evening, the house was quiet. The children were asleep, their soft breathing filling the nursery. Their small bodies curled beneath warm blankets. The world outside was still. The sky painted in deep shades of midnight blue. The stars shimmering in their silent watch over the earth. Elliot had been in the kitchen, pouring himself a glass of water, lost in thought. Then, Nina walked in. She wasn't dressed in her usual sharp blouses and fitted pants. She wasn't the guarded, determined woman he was used to sparring with during the day. She was barefoot, her hair loose over her shoulders, wearing nothing but an oversized sweater that slipped slightly down one shoulder. revealing the delicate slope of her collarbone. For a moment, Elliot forgot how to breathe. She froze when she saw him, her lips parting slightly in surprise. "Oh," she murmured. "I thought you were asleep." Elliot's grip tightened around the glass in his hand. "Couldn't sleep." Nina hesitated, then let out a quiet sigh as she ran a hand through her hair. "Yeah, me neither." Silence settled between them, thick and heavy. There were 1,000 things he wanted to say to her, but he didn't know how. Because for all his power, for all his wealth, Elliot Grayson had never learned how to ask for something his heart truly wanted. So instead, he reached for the bottle of water on the counter and held it out to her. Nina raised an eyebrow but took it without question, twisting off the cap and taking a slow sip. Then, a soft melody drifted through the air. It was coming from the old radio on the kitchen shelf, the volume barely audible, the sound of a slow, jazzy tune filling the room like a whisper. Nina smiled. "This song," she murmured. "My mom used to play it all the time." Elliot watched her, the way her lips curled slightly at the memory, the way her fingers tapped absently against the water bottle in her hands. He didn't think, he just moved, before he could stop himself, before he could remind himself that this was dangerous, that he was playing with something far too fragile to break. He stepped forward and held out his hand. Nina blinked. "What? Dance with me," he said quietly. Her breath caught. For a moment, she hesitated. Then, slowly, tentatively, she placed her hand in his. Elliot exhaled. He pulled her close, one hand resting lightly on her waist, the other still wrapped around her fingers. And slowly, they began to sway. The room was silent except for the soft hum of the music. Nina's body was warm against his, her touch gentle but certain, as if she wasn't entirely sure what this was, but she wasn't willing to pull away either. Elliot swallowed. If he were a better man, he would let go. If he were a wiser man, he would walk away before this became something he couldn't survive losing. But he wasn't. He was just a man who had fallen in love with someone he had no right to love. And for one stolen moment, he allowed himself to pretend. "Nina," he murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. She looked up at him, her brown eyes shimmering beneath the dim light. "What?" she asked softly. Tell her that you love her. Tell her that she is the first thing you think about in the morning and the last thing you dream about at night. Tell her that she means more to you than the world itself. Tell her that for the first time in your life, you are afraid, because she has the power to break you in a way no one else ever could. Tell her." Elliot opened his mouth, but nothing came out. Coward. Instead, he did something even more reckless. He cupped her face. His fingers brushed against her cheek, his thumb tracing the soft curve of her jaw, his heartbeat pounding so loudly he was sure she could hear it. Nina's lips parted slightly, her breath hitching, but she didn't pull away. Elliot leaned in. Their foreheads touched, close enough to feel the warmth of her skin, close enough to taste the air between them. 1 inch closer, and he would be lost forever. But before he could close the distance, a small, sleepy whimper came from the hallway. They froze. Then, another whimper. "Sean." Elliot let out a shaky breath and pulled back, his hands dropping to his sides, his entire body screaming at him to stay close, to pull her in, to finish what he started. But he couldn't, because they weren't just two people dancing in a kitchen. They were two people raising children together. Two people tangled in a life far more complicated than either of them had asked for. And if they did this, if they crossed this line, there would be no turning back. Nina swallowed hard, as if trying to steady herself. Then, slowly, she pulled away. I should go check on him," she whispered. Elliot nodded, his throat too tight to speak. He watched as she turned, as she disappeared down the hall, as the soft creak of the nursery door slipped into silence. And when he was finally alone, he closed his eyes. He should have told her. But now, it might be too late. Elliot Grayson had never been a man who let emotions rule him. His entire life had been built on controlling his company, his decisions, his future. He had never allowed himself the luxury of falling apart, of making choices based on feeling instead of logic. But Nina Calloway? She had undone him, piece by piece, without even trying. She had broken down every wall he had so carefully built around himself. She had challenged him, pushed him, made him want things he had long convinced himself he could never have. Now, as he stood in the dim glow of the nursery, watching her, he realized he couldn't fight it anymore. It had been a long night. The storm outside had finally passed. But its echoes still lingered, soft rain tapping against the window panes. The faint scent of damp earth drifting through the air. Nina was sitting in the rocking chair, her body curled protectively around Sean, his tiny hands gripping the fabric of her shirt as he slept against her chest. The warmth of the room, the steady rhythm of her breathing, the way she held him like he was the most precious thing in the world, it did something to Elliot. It hit him with a force so strong it nearly knocked the breath from his lungs. This was his family, not in the way the world defined it, not in the way people would expect, but in the way that mattered most. They were a family because they had built something together. Because when things had fallen apart, when the world had thrown chaos and heartbreak their way, they had held on. And Elliot knew, with an aching certainty, that he couldn't lose this. He couldn't lose her. His fingers curled into fists at his sides. He had to tell her. He had to tell her now. Nina. His voice was quiet, but it still made her glance up, her eyes heavy with exhaustion. Elliot hesitated, the words hovering on the tip of his tongue. But then he saw it, the way her fingers gently stroked Sean's tiny back. The way she blinked slowly, too tired to put up the usual walls between them. This was his chance. "I love you," he said. The words hung in the air, heavier than anything he had ever spoken before. Nina stilled. For a long moment, she didn't say anything. Elliot's heart pounded against his ribs. He had never been afraid of anything in his life, not losing deals, not risking millions, not even standing before the most powerful men in the world. But waiting for her response? That terrified him. Finally, she exhaled. Her eyes searched his, as if trying to find something, as if trying to believe him. "You can't say things like that, Elliot," she whispered, "not when we have so much to lose." But he shook his head. "No, I should have said it sooner. I should have told you from the moment I realized it." He took a step forward, his voice rough with every emotion he had held back for too long. "I love you, Nina, and not because it's easy. Not because it's convenient. I love you because I can't not love you." She swallowed, her arms instinctively tightening around Sean. "This isn't simple," she murmured. "I know. What if we ruin everything?" Elliot let out a quiet, almost broken laugh. "We're not ruining anything, Nina," he said. "We've built something real, and I know you feel it too." She looked down, her lips parting as if she wanted to argue. But she couldn't, because she did feel it. She had always felt it. "I don't know how to do this," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. Elliot stepped closer, slowly, carefully. "Then let me show you," he said. His fingers brushed against her cheek, tilting her face up to his. Her breath hitched. She had spent so long running from this, convincing herself that what they had was nothing more than circumstance and responsibility. But now, standing in the soft glow of the nursery, wrapped in the quiet hum of the night, she knew there was no running anymore. Elliot was right. She loved him too. And it was terrifying, but it was also undeniable. She didn't think. She didn't plan. She just moved. 1 second, she was standing there, heart pounding in her chest. The next, she was pulling him in. Elliot barely had time to react before her lips crashed against his, stealing the air from his lungs, unraveling him in ways he hadn't thought possible. It wasn't soft. It wasn't careful. It was everything they had held back for too long, all the tension, all the longing, all the words they had never dared to say. Elliot's hands found her waist, pulling her closer, as if he was afraid she would disappear if he let go. Nina melted into him, her fingers curling into the fabric of his shirt, her body molding against his like it had always belonged there. And in that moment, everything changed. Because there was no denying it anymore. No more pretending. No more running. This was real. This was forever. When they finally pulled apart, both breathless, Nina let out a quiet laugh. "God, we're in trouble," she murmured. Elliot smirked, his forehead resting against hers. "The best kind of trouble," he said. She rolled her eyes, but there was no real annoyance in it. Only warmth, only something she had been afraid to name until now. She reached up, her fingers brushing against his jaw, memorizing the feel of him. "I love you too," she whispered. Elliot closed his eyes, exhaling a shaky breath. Then he kissed her again. Softer this time, Slower. Like a promise. And this time, neither of them pulled away. The night air was thick with tension, pressing against the Grand Shelton estate like an omen. Inside, the dim glow of the chandelier barely reached the corners of the grand foyer, casting long, fractured shadows across the polished floors. Dorothy stood frozen, her heart hammering in her chest, as she stared at the two figures standing on the doorstep. Jason and her father. The past had arrived. Douglas Calloway looked different than she remembered. The once rugged face was now gaunt, the lines deeper, the weight of a wasted life settling into his bones. He would have looked old if not for the sharpness in his gaze. The flicker of something too familiar, desperation. The kind that had always ruled him. She had seen it before. Jason, however, was exactly the same. His presence infected the air, thick and suffocating. His smirk was slow, dripping with mockery, as if he had been expecting this moment for years. "Well," Jason murmured, tilting his head, "look at you, sweetheart, all settled in like a little housewife. Almost cute." Dorothy flinched at the sound of his voice, her fingers curling into her palms, nails digging into her skin just to keep herself from shaking. She turned to Douglas instead. "Why?" The word came out broken, barely above a whisper. Douglas shifted uncomfortably, his lips parting as if searching for the right words. But none came. Dorothy's voice rose. "Why? How could he? After everything? After what Jason had done to her?" Douglas lowered his head. That was her answer. She had always known what kind of man her father was. But a small, pathetic part of her had hoped. That part had just died. Jason sighed dramatically, as if he was tired of the conversation already. Family reunions. Always so emotional. Dorothy snapped her head toward him. "Go to hell." Jason chuckled. Now, he said smoothly. "I didn't come here for you." Her breath stalled. Jason's gaze flicked past her, toward the warmth of the house behind her. "The babies." His smirk widened. "I've come to collect what's mine." Dorothy's blood turned to ice. "No, you son of a..." Before she could finish, Thomas stepped forward, placing himself between her and Jason. His presence was a wall, solid, unmoving, dangerous. "You're not taking them." Jason's smirk didn't falter. "Oh, come on, Shelton. You're a businessman. You understand contracts. Those kids?" He tilted his head. "They're mine." Dorothy ran off with stolen property. Thomas didn't blink. "You don't own them." Jason's expression darkened, his patience wearing thin. "Tell you what," he mused. "I'll be generous. You can keep Dorothy. She's damaged goods anyway." His smirk was razor sharp. "But the kids? They come with me." Dorothy lunged. She didn't think, she just moved. Jason barely had time to react before she collided into him, all fists and fury and heartbreak. "You bastard," she screamed. Punching, clawing, fighting. Jason snarled, grabbing her by the shoulders and shoving her back. She stumbled, nearly falling, but before he could strike again, Thomas moved. He launched himself forward, tackling Jason to the ground. They hit the floor hard. A brutal rhythm of fists and snarled curses. Jason was fast, but so was Thomas. They clashed, their bodies colliding in a whirlwind of raw strength and desperation. Jason fought like an animal, dirty, ruthless, unrelenting, but Thomas had something Jason didn't. Something worth protecting. Dorothy watched, her pulse pounding against her ribs. Jason's men stepped forward, ready to intervene, when suddenly, bang, a gunshot rang out. "Take one more step." Donna's voice cut through the chaos, calm and unwavering. Everyone froze. Dorothy turned. Donna stood at the top of the stairs, a shotgun aimed directly at Jason's men. Her face was stone. "I just called the police." She cocked the gun. "I'd love to see what they make of all this." Jason cursed under his breath. "Upstairs," Donna commanded. "Now." Dorothy ran. She bolted toward the nursery, throwing the door shut behind her. The babies were still asleep, oblivious, safe, for now. Then, a low voice behind her. "You should have run when you had the chance." Dorothy turned. Jason stood in the doorway. And in his hand? A knife. Jason lunged. The blade slashed through the dim light. A silver blur aimed straight for Thomas's chest. But before it could land, a body moved. The knife never reached its target. Instead, it sank into Douglas's chest. Dorothy screamed. Her father staggered, his breath hitching, his hands flying to the blade buried deep in his ribs. Jason stepped back, eyes widening, as if he hadn't expected that. For a moment, everything stopped. Then, Douglas crumpled to the floor. Dorothy ran to him, dropping to her knees. No, no, no. Blood seeped through his shirt, pooling beneath him. His breath came in short, uneven gasps, each one weaker than the last. Dorothy's hands pressed against the wound. Stay with me, she begged. You idiot, why did you? Douglas's hand trembled as he grasped hers. His grip weak, but his eyes, for the first time in her entire life, were full of something real. Something close to love. His lips parted, blood staining his teeth. He rasped. Dorothy choked back a sob. You think? A faint, wretched smile pulled at his lips. I should have been better. His fingers twitched against hers. Then, they went still. Dorothy's breath caught. She shook him. No, 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 don't. But his eyes were already empty. A shattering silence settled over the room. Jason scoffed, rolling his shoulders. Well, that was dramatic. Dorothy's head snapped up. She didn't think. She didn't hesitate. She lunged. Jason barely had time to react before her fists slammed into him. Full of grief, rage, loss, she fought like a woman who had nothing left to lose. And then, sirens. The front door burst open. Police. Jason froze. Thomas moved. In one swift, brutal motion, he tackled Jason to the ground. Handcuffs snapped around Jason's wrists. And finally, it was over. The night was quiet again. The police had taken Jason away. But Douglas, he was gone. Dorothy stood in the doorway, her father's blood still warm on her hands. For years, she had hated him. For years, she had wished him gone. And now? Now, she would have given anything to take it back. Tears blurred her vision. Thomas stepped beside her, silent. He didn't speak. He just stood there. And for the first time in her life, Dorothy wasn't alone. The sun dipped behind the horizon, casting an amber glow over the small town. The air carried the scent of fresh rain, mingling with the floral aroma that drifted from the open door of evergreen blooms. The little flower shop on the corner. Inside, the warm golden light reflected off vases filled with delicate arrangements, peonies, lilacs, and roses, their colors standing boldly against the soft cream walls. It was quiet, peaceful, a stark contrast to the chaos Dorothy had lived through. She stood behind the wooden counter, carefully tying a satin ribbon around the last bouquet of the evening. A soft smile played at her lips. This had become her new life, a life she never thought she would have. A life she never thought she deserved. 6 months had passed since that night, the night her father sacrificed himself. The night Jason was finally taken away. The night everything changed. And somehow, against all odds, she had survived. At first, it had felt impossible. The weight of her father's death sat heavy on her chest. A strange and painful mix of grief and confusion. Douglas had been a coward. A man who had spent years running from his mistakes, but in the end, he had faced them head on. He had chosen her. He had chosen to be a father when it mattered most. And for that, Dorothy chose to forgive him. There were nights she still woke up gasping, haunted by the memories of Jason, of the years she had spent in his shadow. But now, she had something stronger than fear. She had Thomas. She had Simon, Peter, and Sean. She had a family. The bell above the shop door chimed. She didn't need to look up to know who it was. You're late, she murmured, setting the bouquet aside. Thomas leaned against the counter. His tie slightly loosened, his sleeves rolled up as if he had come straight from a meeting. His hair was slightly tousled, probably from Simon's tiny hands grabbing at it before he left the house. Had a call, he said smoothly, watching her. Missed you at the house today. Dorothy smirked. I was here, running a business. Donna thinks you overwork yourself. Dorothy chuckled. I think Donna just likes having me around to keep you in check. Thomas exhaled a quiet laugh, shaking his head. You might be right. For months, this had become their routine. Thomas showing up after work, bringing her coffee, leaning against the counter and watching her tie ribbons around bouquets. At first, Dorothy had thought it was obligation. That maybe, deep down, Thomas felt responsible for her and the kids. That his presence was his way of making sure she was okay. But 6 months was a long time to stay out of guilt. Dorothy had spent years being abandoned, used, cast aside. She knew what it felt like when someone only remained out of duty. And that wasn't what this was. Thomas had a life, a company, a world that had no reason to be tethered to hers. Yet, he kept showing up, and every time he did, it made Dorothy feel like she wasn't just a survivor. She was someone worth staying for. That evening, after closing the shop, Dorothy walked home. The house was warm when she stepped inside, the scent of something roasting in the oven mixing with the laughter of 3 small voices. She paused in the doorway, her heart stumbling over itself. Thomas was on the floor. His sleeves were still rolled up, but now his tie was gone. His posture was relaxed. Simon sat in his lap. Peter was leaning against his side. And Sean was babbling animatedly about something only a toddler could possibly understand. And Thomas was listening, nodding along as if Sean was sharing the most important information in the world. Like he belonged here. Like this was his home. Dorothy swallowed. For months, she had told herself that what she felt for Thomas was gratitude. That it was nothing more than respect for the man who had saved her. The man who had fought for her children. The man who had kept her from falling apart on the worst night of her life. But standing there, watching him like this, she knew the truth. It wasn't just gratitude. It wasn't just relief. It was love. And suddenly, she wondered, had Thomas known before she had? Because when his eyes met hers, he didn't look surprised. He just smiled. A slow, knowing smile. And in that moment, Dorothy knew, she had finally found what she had spent her whole life searching for. Dorothy's story is more than just survival. It's about learning to trust again. It's about finding family in unexpected places. It's about choosing love over fear. For years, she thought love was something she had to earn. That if she was obedient enough, quiet enough, perfect enough, she wouldn't be abandoned. But Thomas never asked her to be perfect. He had stayed because he wanted to. Because that's what real love is. And for the first time in her entire life, Dorothy finally felt like she was home. If Dorothy's journey inspired you, comment stronger below. Show your support, like this video and subscribe to our channel for more powerful stories. Turn on notifications so you never miss an update. And don't forget, share this story with your friends. You never know who might need to hear it today. Because at the end of the day, we are all searching for something. And sometimes, just sometimes, life surprises us with exactly what we need. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next story.